Fast forward now to the year 1776. The United Colonies of America, now referring to themselves as the United States of America, would find further influence for their future constitution within the Revolutionary War itself. The colonials had long blamed Parliament, the British version of our Congress, its lawmaking body, for the pain and suffering caused by all of its taxes and the intolerable acts in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. They had long pledged loyalty to the King of England right up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but their oaths were in vain as George III had no inclination of halting the taxation policies Parliament inflicted upon its own colonies. Furthermore, colonials were enraged throughout the early 1770s by the maintenance of a standing British army among many of their cities, most notably Boston. The colonists were further upset by the dissolution of their courts in which their own judges presided, only to have judges loyal to British interests only, as well as their own financial gain, take over. These three issues would go on to influence colonists' desire to make it very difficult to tax without due representation in the legislature, to not maintain an army during peacetime because of how easily it could be used to oppress the people, and to maintain a judicial branch that was independent of both the executive and legislative branches of the government. It also convinced colonists that no single person in the government should ever be delegated too much power, a characteristic which would become a fatal flaw in our country's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. After the U.S. won its independence in 1781, the Articles of Confederation, which were proposed way back in 1777, became the law of the land. The Articles seem more like a loose agreement between 13 independent and separate nations than a singular body of laws that would unite and bind them together. The colonists' fear of a tyrant rising to power and subsequently oppressing the people of America were so present during their drafting that the Articles contained no executive branch. There would be no president or a king under the Articles of Confederation. Instead, there was one legislative body, the Congress, which housed representatives from the 13 newly independent colonies. Congress could do anything. It could tax, it could wage war, even establish a national religion if it chose, with only one catch. All 13 colonies had to vote unanimously. Now, as you can guess, this rarely happened, and as a result, very little got done. America at this time owed a great deal of money to nations like France, Spain, and the Netherlands, who had lent the U.S. large sums to finance its war against England. However, the Congress under the Articles of Confederation could not agree on how to tax or even effectively pay off these debts, and as a result, the interest on them had sunk the United States further and further into debt during the 1780s, and its currency was barely worth the paper it was printed on outside of its own borders. Further, the need for unanimity hurt the fledgling country's ability to interact with other nations, as any sort of action, such as a treaty, a trade agreement, or a tax on imports like a tariff, all had to be universally agreed upon. By the late 1780s, it was clear to many that either the Articles had to go, or the United States' lifespan would be unmercifully short. Enter the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Representatives from the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia from May to September of what proved to be an especially brutal, sweltering summer. Initially, the delegates to the convention only had permission to discuss and propose methods to edit and alter the Articles, but it soon became clear to most, especially James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who would later leave the convention, attending only briefly, that the Articles had to go if the United States was going to have any shot at longevity, let alone prosperity. Meeting in secrecy, shutting the windows and shuttering them to hide away from a very nosy and imposing press, despite the heat and humidity of the East Coast, the delegates from the 13 colonies mapped out a new government very quickly that would do a great deal right. It created a two-house, or bicameral legislature. If any bill was to become a law, it had to be approved by both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Virginia Plan also used compromise between the northern and southern states to settle the issue of representation in the legislature. The South, vastly unpopulated except for Virginia, compared to many northern states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts, wanted an equal number of legislators from all states to serve in Congress so that they would not lose power to the more populous North. The North felt this was unfair, since this would be equivalent to giving fewer people more power in the government? The answer was a compromise spearheaded by James Madison. The House of Representatives would hold members sent based on a state's population. The larger the state, the more representatives. The Senate would receive 2 members from each state, leveling the playing field between both the large and the small states. Any bill would have to get through both of these chambers. Interestingly, the North did not put up much of a fight when the South successfully bargained for counting 3/5 of its slave population as numbers for representation in the House. In states like Georgia that actually had a larger slave population than a white populace, this meant that these states would get as much as an extra 60% of representation in the House of Representatives, giving them a great deal more power, especially as the slave population would swell to over 4 million persons by the time the Civil War broke out. The North essentially handed the South the keys to the legislature, an imbalance that would require the Civil War to repair. Additionally, from the ideas of Locke and French philosopher Montesquieu, the colonies intertwined all 3 branches of the new government with a series of powers that would help keep one another in check, such as the president's ability to veto bills from Congress and Congress' ability to overturn those vetoes with a 2/3 vote. The judicial branch, oddly, was left rather vague and undescribed, and so its powers would have to be defined later in the country's history. But by 1801, those powers would include judicial review, which gives the Supreme Court the ability to analyze federal laws and, based upon their interpretation of the Constitution, determine if the laws were in line or constitutional and therefore legal. Ultimately, one of the greatest strengths of the Constitution was its ability to amend and repair itself. The amendment process outlined in the 5th of 7 articles or chapters of the Constitution described how, when 3/4 of the states agreed, new laws could become a part of the Constitution, be they the right of the federal government to tax people's income, banning the practice of slavery, giving the women right to vote, or keeping Congress from giving itself raises before its next election is due. The amendment process has allowed the Constitution to change and adapt to the present needs of Americans, and since the Bill of Rights was added in 1789, an additional 17 amendments have been added, the most recent being in 1992. Current ideas for new amendments include everything from a law forcing Congress and the President to balance the federal budget every year, bans as well as allowances for gay marriage, and a woman's equal rights amendment ending legal sexual discrimination. Like the people, the geography, and the character of our nation, our Constitution has changed a great deal in 220 years, and no doubt will look different as the 21st century unfolds. To know America, its flaws and triumphs, its diversity and universality, and how we all seem to hang together as opposed to hanging separately, as Benjamin Franklin once said, is to know the Constitution itself. We will spend more time throughout this course analyzing how our government has changed and what forces put those changes in place, but tomorrow you'll first learn more specifics concerning what this document contains. So, until we meet again, happy history hunting.